Hey everyone, welcome to Revolutions Reconsidered, a deeper dive into the American Revolution. This season, we're focusing on the podcast Worlds Turned Upside Down, unpacking some of the sources, stories, and contributions that make up the show. I'm Dr. Lynn Robbins, and I'm joined by Dr. James Ambuske, creator of Worlds Turned Upside Down. And today we're talking about episode 4, which is called The Empire. And it explores the outcome of the 7 Years' War and then the struggle that everyone was wondering, so now what? And Florida plays a starring role in this episode. So all about Florida today. And I think we all wish right now that we were on a beach. So let's just keep that in the back of our minds. But I will say my absolute favorite town in Florida is St. Augustine. I love visiting there. It definitely, it focuses on the Spanish era, which is kind of new for me because I tend to focus on US a little later. But speaking of that, I think before we get too far, it might help to tell our audience about the timeline of Florida because I feel like it changed hands quite a few times in its history. So can you give us a little bit about that? And my cat says hi.
Hello, Kat, and welcome to Revolutions Reconsidered. And hello, everybody. Well, welcome back, and it's great to be back talking with you again. Yeah, Lynn, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Like the thrust of the Empire, that episode is what comes next, what now, and the Floridas. There are two Floridas, and we'll get to that. Play a pretty significant role in British thinking about how, now that they have won the 7 Years' War, both in North America and in Europe, they're going to transform this place into the kind of empire they want it to be. And, you know, we're not accustomed to thinking of Florida or East and West Florida as two of the 26 British colonies in North America in the 10 years before the American Revolution. But the Floridas are there, and the British have big ambitions for them. And so to answer your question in part, sort of very simply, is when we think about Florida, and you're right, St. Augustine was occupied by the Spanish starting in 1565, I think, if I remember rightly. And you can still see the Spanish forts there. It's still very much interpreted as a Spanish colonial place. But Europeans had contact with Florida earlier in the 16th century. But one of the fascinating things to think about with Florida, and with St. Augustine in particular, as we're thinking about what the British are hoping to accomplish post-1763, is that they may claim this entire land space, and they may begin to map this entire land space, but in many ways they don't occupy really any of it. Our colleague Jason Herbert, who some of our listeners may know as the host of Historians at the Movies, he is an expert on early Florida. I was talking to him recently, and he said, one of the things to think about is that really, the Spanish are only occupying St. Augustine. They don't really control anywhere else. And so if you think about it like that, the task that the British have in 1763, when the Spanish cede Florida, that we all know and love, to the British in the Treaty of Paris at that moment, one of the things they're thinking about is how can we actually occupy more of this space and transform it into a colony that is beyond St. Augustine, that is beyond Pensacola, and incorporate it into the British Empire. So, for 300 years or so, it's controlled by the Spanish. Controlled, let's put that in air quotes, because this is really an indigenous place with a variety of native nations. But when the British acquire it in 1763, the idea is how can we transform this place into a plantation economy on order of what you might find around Charleston, South Carolina, or what you might find in Jamaica or Barbados. How can we make this an agriculturally productive place that can contribute to the empire?
So speaking of empire, of course, the episode is called The Empire. And I actually looked up the word empire because I was wondering when when the British, I'm not British, when the British acquired...
We used to be.
That's true, yes. It's my accomplishment. So when Florida was acquired by the British Empire, this adds quite a bit of landmass. It complicates what the empire was previously. So does this force a change in the empire, or do you think it actually made them rethink what their empire was and almost started a new empire. How would you sort of categorize what was happening at that time?
Yeah, that's a fun question because it's sort of all of the above. In a sense that there had been a long-standing belief amongst ministers in London, particularly the Board of Trade. And the Board of Trade is this government body that manages colonial affairs on behalf of the government. That long-standing belief that this haphazard hodgepodge series of colonies on the North American mainland and in the Caribbean weren't really productive for the empire in ways that they could be. And in part because of the way they had been settled. You have, sort of, as one scholar would say, religious fanatics settling in Massachusetts who then beget religious fanatics in Rhode Island. You've got plantations in South Carolina. You've got tobacco fields in Virginia. All this sort of mix of colonies that were settled by corporate charters or proprietors and whatnot, sort of no coherent imperial system. Not in the ways that we would think, where an empire is being ruled from a capital and that the empire itself, or the metropolis, you might say, let's call it London, is imposing some kind of order. Mm-hmm. Imperial thinkers in the 1740s, 1750s, and certainly by the 1760s want to take this moment and remake the empire into the kind of ways they wanted it to be so that there is more imperial management coming from London. One of the things we've talked about in earlier episodes of both this show and then in the podcast itself is the British want to take greater control of Indian relations. So they established the Indian Department. Mm-hmm. They want better regulations that can coordinate trade amongst the different colonies and ensure efficient trade back to the mother country. Right. One of the things that they have not been able to successfully control, though, is settlement. That has largely been done by private enterprise. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that the British are beginning to worry about is if colonization is not done in an orderly fashion, it can create negative relationships with native peoples as settlers try to move west of the Appalachian Mountains, or those settlers might, in a sense, become out of touch with the home government. And so that they could not become, or they would not be effectively under British rule. Right. So all these changes are happening, and the idea is that they're going to try to impose a new form of colonialism where it's going to be directly managed from London, that London ministers will allocate land grants, they will structure how these colonies are going to be run, all in the interest of making for a more efficient empire, but also for making a more loyal empire, so that it can become this kind of empire that they really think is in the best interest of all British peoples, that can create congenial relations with native peoples, and that can lead to prosperity. And so the two Floridas, St. John's Island, what we now call Prince Edward Island, the ceded islands in the Caribbean, Dominica, Grenada, and others, they're all part of this effort to more directly manage colonization in the interest of mutual prosperity across the board.
That sounds like a lot. There's a lot going on with this. And I think one of the things that just fascinates me about this time period is their ability to survey land and create accurate maps, because they couldn't fly over the area. They couldn't, have satellite images like we have now. So when the British sort of, were ceded Florida, were there already maps? Did someone have to go out and survey it? Or did cartographers just go nuts and start running out and trying to figure out, okay, we need to map this so we can figure out how it's going to be governed, because you have to know what you have.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, one of the frustrations of military commanders during the 7 Years' War was the lack of accurate maps that was readily available. So, you had military engineers with you that would draw maps in the fields and whatnot, but there was no sort of comprehensive, let's call it an atlas, that they could point to figure out the North American landscape as they plan their campaigns. So as part of the creating this new empire, and we'll talk much more about this in future episodes of Worlds Turned Upside Down, but one of the initiatives that the king, the Board of Trade, and the government ministry begin to do is they implement what's called the General Survey of North America. Okay. This is a massive cartographic expedition to chart the coasts of North America, particularly the northern coast, so that they can have a more accurate sense of the harbors, They can get a handle on Quebec and Nova Scotia in the interest of planning the development of those colonies in the post-war period, but also the Floridas, trying to ascertain where the best places might be for indigo plantations or sugar plantations, trying to and in the interest then of attracting investors and settlers to these places so that they have a sense of where they're going to go to. So cartography is hugely important. And a man named Samuel Holland leads the northern section of this survey. He's charting the northern coasts. He had been in the 7 Years' War as a cartographer. Actually, James Cook, the famous explorer who will do a lot of exploring in the Pacific in the later 18th century, he's a key map maker during the 7 Years' War. And a man named DeBarre is put in charge of the southern portion of this survey, looking at these places like Florida, and trying to figure out how we can best capture the shape of this new empire, whether Florida is like a single landmass or is it just a bunch of islands that nobody can figure out where they are, and where are the best places to settle, where are the best places to build plantations, so that they can begin to move forward with what they hope is a prosperous future.
Right, because I imagine you have to look at soil, you have to start to understand the climate. I don't know their thoughts about hurricanes and weather events such as that. I can only imagine. That's another worry.
For sure.
And I was interested that there was an East and West Florida. And that was something that I think was newer to me, trying to think of it as the East and West and even figuring out what that meant. I guess we were talking about the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast.
Right.
But I believe you have a map that we can show to give us an idea of how we should be looking at Florida at this time as opposed to, modern day Florida.
Yeah. And the map we've got here is by a man named Gibson. It was actually drawn in 1763, and it's called, I think, a plan for the new governments of Florida, and it shows East and West Florida divided on this map with an insert in the lower left corner of Pensacola, which is one of the key settlements of West Florida. And the idea by dividing the two up is to kind of make two administrative units that could be then governed more effectively. Because as you rightly point out, what becomes West Florida is on the Gulf Coast. That's a kind of different landscape than you might find on the Atlantic side of Florida. But one of the wonderful things about this map, as we can see here, right, is that East Florida just looks like a bunch of islands. Crisscrossed by these rivers. And this is a trope through the end of the 18th century. Cartographers can't sort of wrap their heads around what this thing is. A scholar named Michel Navakis has written a really great book called Liquid Landscapes that looks at the cartography of Florida and Florida in the popular imagination in this period. But they're struggling to figure it out. And it's always a fun thing to show students that as crazy as you think Florida is these days, people had some really funny ideas about it in the 18th century.
Well, and I notice on the map, they really don't talk about inhabitants or anything about indigenous peoples who were there, correct? And were we just ignoring the fact that they were there or hoping that they would leave? Is that how they dealt with it, with the cartography?
Yeah, and in some cases, yes, some cases, no. I mean, you'll see some maps where it's very clear where native nations are. This is particularly clear on John Mitchell's 1755 map of the middle colonies of British America, where the Haudenosaunee are very prominently displayed, the Miami, different peoples in the interior. On this map, and to your point, it's as important as what we see on that map as what we don't.
Right.
And so we're not really seeing evidence of the Choctaws. We're not really seeing evidence of the Creeks or the people that become known as the Seminoles. But they're there. But what it's also doing is you have to imagine this map being presented to somebody, a potential investor in London, and saying, here, look at this place. It's terra incognita. This is a place ripe for settlement. No one's really there. And so start picking out your lot. Where would you like to settle? Just front some money, make sure to pay the king's quit rents. You have to pay a small little kind of rent when you get your land. But it's designed to present the idea that is open for settlement. It is open for the taking, and that no one is really going to get in your way while you're there.
That's fascinating because I never thought of maps as having a purpose beyond showing the
Right.
land. But there's actually something behind just the image, that there may be something behind that, why you see what you see and don't what you don't. So
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
yeah. I mean, maps. We think of maps as places or as objects that help us to get to where we need to go.
Right.
But in any century, and especially in the 18th century, they are highly political objects that are conveying certain agendas or conveying certain desires that you really have to sit and study it to think about, all right, what is the map maker trying to say? And who is he trying to say it on behalf of?
That's absolutely fascinating. I love that about the map you showed. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And I would love to talk about the immigrants to
Hmm.
Florida who are coming in. And I was very happy that you talked about a woman, a Scottish woman, at the beginning of the episode, Isabella Chrystie Bruce. She was a Scottish immigrant, moved with her husband to Pensacola in
Right.
1769. And of course, he was in search of riches. You know, land meant riches at the time.
Sure.
So you give up your entire life. So you have this woman, she gives up her friends, her family, everything she knows to come to this new land that they may have been told is empty.
Hmm.
Based on the maps, they're told that. But there were no guarantees. It's
Right.
not, and maybe they felt it was more solid than it was, that it was a guarantee. But can you put us in the mindset
Hmm.
of these immigrants and what they're thinking, and sort of what's the pull?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Isabella Chrystie Bruce is a figure who is very prominent in Dr. Kathleen Duvall's book, Independent Lost.
Hmm.
And, we draw on her research to tell Isabella's story. The pull I think, as you say, is the idea in part that you can experience success in North America in the wake of the 7 Years' War in a new place like Florida.
Hmm.
Now, the Bruces are a little bit different than maybe some of the lower sort, you might say, who are going to the back country of North Carolina or the back country of Virginia. James Bruce, her husband, receives a pretty significant land grant as a consequence of his service in the 7 Years' War. One of the things you could do as an officer, as a soldier, is you could get a land grant as a consequence of your service. So he chooses to take his land grant in this new colony of West Florida. He's on the governor's council in West Florida,
Hmm.
so he has a prominent station. He's also the collector of His Majesty's customs in West Florida as well. So he's pretty high up in the government. He has a crown appointment. He has this land grant. And the idea, thinking then, is that they are going to transform this place into a plantation.
Right.
He goes there in, I think, 1764, 1765. He and Isabella get married in 1769, at which time then she goes with him from Aberdeen,
Hmm.
Scotland, to West Florida in an attempt to build a new life, in an attempt to be part of the colonial elite. And of course, as we talked about in the episode, part of building your wealth is also on the backs of enslaved people,
Right.
where they have enslaved people they call Caithness and Glasgow and Aberdeen, sort of named after the places that they have left in Scotland, in a kind of perverse, sort of twisted reminder of home.
Hmm. Well, and before we get too much into the Florida that they encountered, I think it's really important to talk about the trip, because I worked on George Washington's Barbados diary, and
Right.
I would never get on one of those ships for a month. I mean, the ships are tiny. They're called ships, but to us, they
Right.
would be absolutely tiny, and you're on it for a month. And I just imagine what this poor woman must have went through to get from Scotland to
Hmm.
Florida. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
It's not exactly a cruise ship.
It's not we're not talking about Carnival Cruise here. This is not a Disney cruise. There's no staterooms that you're probably going to stay in. But, Lynn, as you know, from working on the Barbados diary, these are not exactly the most accommodating or comforting of vessels, even if you do have, or you are of some means. So we can speculate about the journey in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, they could have come from Aberdeen, sailed into the North Sea, and then dropped down into the Atlantic. More than likely, and I'm speculating on this, and Professor Duvall doesn't talk about it in her book, but just based on my own work on Scottish immigrants in the Revolutionary period, what they probably did is they probably traveled down to Edinburgh in the south and then headed west to Glasgow, which was a major port connecting Scotland and the American colonies. From there, they would have sailed south past the coast of West Africa before picking up the current to carry them west through into the Caribbean, past what was at one point Spanish Cuba, briefly in British hands, but then Spanish again, before sailing up into Pensacola. So it's not a straight shot. It's not the modern day cruise ships where you can leave Liverpool and just, make a beeline across the Atlantic. Right. You are at the mercy of the winds. You are at the mercy of the currents. But by this point, there is a well-known route that's going to take you a little bit of time to get there, a month, 6 weeks, somewhere in there. But as long as you're lucky in many respects and have a good captain, you'll get there safely.
So I've sadly never been to Scotland. I have been to Western Europe. I've been to England. I've been to Ireland, and I do not imagine that the climate, the land, pretty much anything in Florida reminded them of their home in Scotland. And since you have the expertise in Scotland, what do you think the shock would have been, especially to Isabella when she goes from Scotland to this new land and they end up in Pensacola?
Right, for sure. It must have been, well, we know actually a little bit about what she might have thought, and we can talk about sources here in a second, for sure. But, Aberdeen, if you've been to Scotland, Aberdeen in the 18th century is beginning to become the place we know now. That is, the city itself in the late 18th and 19th century becomes this, what they call the city of granite, because they're quarrying all the granite from nearby quarries, and it just, on the right days, it just sparkles in the sunlight. It's actually quite amazing. But by the time that they're leaving, those buildings aren't quite there yet. And so you're dealing with a Scottish world that is, very agricultural. Aberdeen is sort of connected to the North Sea trade there, so it's facing continental Europe. Scottish summers tend to be pretty mild. In the northern part of Scotland, it can get pretty cold and pretty cold rains in the winter, which is actually quite exhilarating, I have to say. But then she gets lucky in that they arrive in Pensacola in the wintertime.
Right. And
so she's not yet experienced the heat of the 18th century Florida summer sun. And of course there are sandy beaches. There are tropical environments there, palm trees, whatnot. Enslaved people that she probably already would have seen. Slavery is not unknown in Britain in terms of enslaved people being there, more so in the South in England than in Scotland, but nonetheless not unknown. But she's entering a Caribbean adjacent world, let's say, where slavery is predominant. And so the entire social order is going to look different. She's still on top of that social order, but it is a much more multicultural, multilingual place than she would have encountered back home in Scotland, for sure.
Right. And like you had just mentioned about talking about sources, I was excited, of course, that she was mentioned because women's history, especially at this time period, is quite difficult.
Right.
Usually it's going to be through the lens or the writings of their husband or their brother or their father. Basically, a gentleman in their life. It's tougher to get something directly from them. And I believe that none of Isabella's letters do survive, but a lot of her story can be told through the knowledge of someone of her station or someone who lived in Pensacola. So you're sort of taking, I don't want to say a generalization, but you're taking an understanding and then assuming, not necessarily in the making an educated, I don't like the word
Right.
assume, making educated guesses as to what her experience was. And so what sources
Hmm.
were used? And I'm also interested in how you feel about those sources. I think it's great that we can do this, but it also sometimes makes me feel like we're almost taking the individual out of the story because it's more of a generalized experience.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to look at it. In some ways, it's almost like you're using sonar and you're just sort of hoping to get some kind of echo of the past
Right.
as best you can by reading against the grain, if you will, or trying to pull certain sources inside out. I mean, one of the things I love about what Professor Duvall did in her book, and she talks a little bit about this in the episode, is how it was a real struggle to figure out if the Isabella Chrystie she was seeing in sort of church records and marriage records in Scotland was the same person that eventually travels to Florida.
Right.
And she talks about in the episode quite fascinatingly that she's not confident. She's pretty sure, but you can never be totally sure that it's the same person until she actually gets married. And there is a stronger record through her husband in West Florida as a consequence of that. So one of the things that we know, and historians all know, but the public should too, footnotes are your friend because they can help you understand how scholars reconstruct the past. And so looking at Professor Duvall's footnotes was really fun because it was a journey into how she reconstructed this life. Some of it was official records that show up from West Florida. Some of it was James Bruce's Loyalist claim, and we'll get to Loyalists over the course of our conversations, Lynn, and certainly in the series. But suffice to say, in 1783, when things go finally completely wrong for Britain and the United States achieves independence, they begin to compensate Loyalists for their loyalty, and you file a claim to do that. And so in those claims, you list your assets, what you suffered, things like that. So we can begin to get a sense of Isabella's material existence and potential wealth. But then one of the things we can also do is use sort of proxies. So there was a Scottish noblewoman named Janet Shaw who takes a tour of the Caribbean and North America around the same time. She wrote a diary. It survives and it's been published. And so you can begin to use her experiences as a kind of approximate what Isabella Chrystie might have seen from that journey from Aberdeen in the Caribbean onward to Pensacola and the sort of the nature of the colonies. Because we kind of assume that there might have been sort of a similar status between the two women that would then allow us to extrapolate their cultural reactions and cultural mindset to what Isabella might have encountered in Florida.
And it seems like you would have to generalize even more to talk about the enslaved community because I mean they're named after towns. Like there's any sense of a personality, being even with a name is sort of stripped from them. So what sort of sources were used for, like the individuals that the Bruces had?
Yeah, I mean, and as you and I know, and a lot of other folks know who've worked with sources about enslaved people, is sometimes you're lucky to even get names. Sometimes they're just, numbers on a page. And so oftentimes what we're working with for sources of enslaved people are things like estate inventories, as perverse as that can be, right? Because they are considered property in this period. Sometimes correspondence where there is a discussion about a particular enslaved person. Farm reports, as you and I both know, George Washington at Mount Vernon kept very careful farm reports and demanded very careful farm reports that would often list what his enslaved people were doing. But then, runaway ads that were published in newspapers are also an incredible source, and there are a number of digital projects ongoing right now to digitize those materials. And there you find, the names of enslaved people because they are searching for enslaved people and they want other people to capture them. There's descriptions of, their tattoos potentially, physical characteristics. You get a sense of the possible dialects that they're speaking or manner of speech. And so you can begin to get just a hint of who some of these folks were. But again, it's super hard, right? Then you have to sort of take the context and what little evidence you have to try to recreate their existence as best you can.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jim. This has been a fun jaunt through 18th century Florida. I think it's one of my first jaunts so deep into the Floridas. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
I know we're enjoying Worlds Turned Upside Down, so we want to make sure that our listeners check out the next episode. And you know what? If you haven't heard it yet, go back to the first episode and just, time to binge some Worlds Turned Upside Down, right?
Exactly. We are the Netflix of history podcasts.
Yes.
Let's put it like that.
Yes, it's all about binging, and you can't do it just once. So
exactly.
You'll learn something new every time. So let's just, long car rides, let's go ahead and start binging.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
And hey, while you're at it, feel free to check out Too Complicated for History, of which I'm a co-host with Isaac Loftus. And also, let's see, historical birthdays today. So just check out the website of Primary Source Media and all sorts of things we have to offer. And also all the things that Jim and his colleague Jeanette have to offer as well over at George Mason.
Yeah. We're all one big happy podcast family.
Yes, we are. And we also now have a Patreon for Primary Source Media, where we'll have some behind the scenes, some fun things on there, some book giveaways and things like that. So check us out there as well. So thank you so much, Jim. And it was another great episode. And we look forward to talking about the next episode, episode 5. So we're getting closer to the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, it's coming.
It's coming. Not winter, but something is coming. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. You've been listening to Revolutions Reconsidered with Dr. Lynn Price Robbins and Dr. Jim Ambuske. Revolutions is a co-production of Primary Source Media and R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Our producers are Patrick Long, Jeanette Patrick, Lynn Price Robbins, and Jim Ambuske. Join the revolution by heading to primarysourcemedia.com or find Primary Source Media on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.